Good evening. We are going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Overcoming Joint Pain using the Mako technology. This event is hosted by the St. Cloud Surgical Center and will be presented by Dr. Kim Schaap from St. Cloud Orthopedics. Thank you all very much for joining. We're excited to have you here. My name is Sydney Bofferding. I am a marketing consultant with Gaslight Creative. We actually work in conjunction with St. Cloud Surgical Center as their marketing team. I will be your moderator for this event tonight. So this event will be an hour and a half long. So it will start promptly at 6 today, as of right now, and we will go until 7:30. I do want to go over a few housekeeping notes at this time. I would like to let everybody know, please make sure you are muted at all times. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to do that. When you hover over your Zoom screen, at the very bottom left, you should see a microphone that says mute. If there is a slash mark through it, you are already muted. So please just leave it like that throughout the video and throughout the presentation so that we can focus on the presenter, so Dr. Schaap. In addition to that, please also make sure that your video is off. That is in the same location as the mute. So you will see stop video at the very bottom left. If you see a red slash mark through that, that does mean that your video is off. And that is what we would like to see. Again, just to focus on the presenter this evening. If you do happen to see that I turn your video off, please don't be alarmed. That is just the moderator coming in and doing their job. So that is just me. All right, so immediately following Dr. Schaap's presentation, there will be a question and answer portion of this presentation. So you may ask all of your questions in the chat box. The chat box is located at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen, so please use this to type in the questions. So again, if you would hover over your screen, at the very bottom in the middle, there should be a chat button. You may click on that and type in your questions. I, again, Sydney, will be moderating those questions and will be providing those to Dr. Schaap during the question and answer portion of this presentation. You may add your questions at any time, that is not a problem, but we will not address those until the very end. So let's get started. I would like to introduce Dr. Schaap. So again, welcome to the webinar, Overcoming Joint Pain Using Mako Technology. So Dr. Schaap, she is an orthopedic surgeon at St. Cloud Orthopedics. She actually joined St. Cloud Orthopedics in 1999, and she has a special interest in sports medicine, including arthroscopic knee and shoulder procedures, as well as minimally invasive joint replacements. She is also very experienced in robotically assisted knee replacements. So that's a very brief synopsis, but from here, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Schaap.
Thanks, Sydney. Can you hear me? Very good, and thank you all for coming. It's a new format for us, so if you have comments or concerns about the format or issues or concerns, please let us know. You can give those in the comment form at the end, or even send it through the chat, and Sydney can maybe help us fix those along the way if we need to. All right, so I'm gonna get my screen up here. All right, and everybody, Sydney, are you seeing that okay?
I am, Dr. Schaap. It looks great.
Very good. Okay. So tonight we're going to focus on Mako Robotic-Arm Assisted Surgery for joint replacement. We're going to cover both knees and hips. My disclaimer is that I am not doing total hip replacements anymore, but we will kind of review that. And certainly there are several of my partners that are very, very skilled in that aspect. So we're certainly happy to take care of you if that's what you're looking for. That's me. A couple years ago, different hair color, but I am an orthopedic surgeon at St. Cloud Orthopedics. And again, as Sydney said, I've been there almost 21 years this summer. I began in 1999. I do have one physician extender. Actually, right now, I have two because I'm transitioning from one to the other. I'm board certified in general orthopedics and sports medicine and specialize in sports medicine, specifically knee and shoulder issues, as well as minimally invasive knee replacements. I've been doing the robotic assisted joint replacements since 2015. And in fact, was the first woman in the country doing knees, as knees came out after hips, and it was a new technology or new software for the robot. And our group happened to be one of the very first in the country to get to use it. So that was kind of a nice honor for me. I do not have any financial or consulting relationships with Stryker, but they have provided resources and materials for this presentation. And we'll specifically talk about a Stryker knee product and hip product that are married basically to the Mako platform, which is how Mako actually became a much bigger presence in the market here a few years ago. And we'll touch on that as well. So we're going to talk about joint pain and some common causes. We're going to talk about some treatment options. And then specifically, we are going to touch on some non-surgical treatments because I don't want everybody to think that if you come in and you have a little arthritis in your knee and your hip, the only thing we're going to offer you is a surgery. We're also going to talk about joint replacement and how it works. And then obviously we're going to talk about the Mako Robotic-Assisted Surgery and what that lends in terms of precision and improvement in the process of joint replacement that we've been doing for a long time. Obviously, your joints are involved in everything you do every day. Walking, bending, turning requires the use of your hips and knees, and gravity is working on all of us, so our hips and our knees take a little bit of a beating. If you've had other injuries or do heavy lifting or heavy loading for work or play activities, that can also be a significant factor in terms of progression of damage or wear in your joint. Those diseased, injured hips and knees can really limit what you can do from a work or a play perspective. They limit your ability to carry things or move about easily or even get up out of a chair easily. Joint degeneration can actually be very different for different people. It can be there all the time. It can come and go. It can be different on any given day. It can occur even when you're at rest or if you're moving around and putting load or stress through those joints. And it can be located in lots of parts of your body. Some people have single areas of involvement. Some people have nearly every joint in their body that's involved. Some of the common causes that we think and talk about are osteoarthritis, which is actually a wearing out or wear and tear of the joint surface cartilage. So when we talk about cartilage in the joint, many people think of the cartilage in the knee and that you tear your cartilage. That's actually what we call a meniscus. That's a shock absorber in the joint. When we think about cartilage wearing, softening, and being a part of the arthritic process, it's actually the white, shiny covering of the bone. It's the gliding surface in the joint. And if you break open a chicken wing, when you're eating those chicken wings, you see that white, shiny, smooth surface. That's what we call articular cartilage. And when that softens and thins and eventually wears off, that's what true osteoarthritis is. It is a very, very common cause of disability and healthcare use in our country, and it limits 30 million Americans. I would say that figure is actually from some years ago. It's that demographic continues to grow as we see more of the baby boomers entering an era where they're having some of these difficulties and yet still very, very active. We certainly see the impact of arthritis on our nation. Rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune type of arthritis. There are a couple of others, but this is the one that's most well known. This is actually your body attacking itself. The immune system, for some reason, decides that it doesn't like some of the cells in the joint lining, and it'll actually cause chronic inflammation in the joint, which eventually will cause wear to that same articular cartilage and actual bony erosions even sometimes. This is a very common illness as well. At least 1.5 million people, more typically men, or excuse me, more typically women, but men will get it, and usually that's later in life. So if you see a healthy knee, again, that white shiny surface, that articular cartilage looks smooth, and no changes in terms of its thickness or thinness, as well as its overall contour. The cartilage, the meniscus or the shock absorbers between the two bones are also well formed and don't have any fraying or tearing. Then if you look at the arthritic knee on the right, and obviously this is just a drawing, but it's starting to show that those areas of that white cartilage are now no longer smooth. And eventually, if you get wear on both that femur or thigh bone side and the tibia or leg bone side, you'll have what we call bone on bone arthritis. So in x-rays, what do we see? On the left, again, the normal knee, uh, well-maintained joint spaces, although I would tell you, having looked at thousands of x-rays, there's probably a little bit of early wear on that left knee. And this is where we sometimes start to see folks come to the office with some complaints. And we can certainly, there are some things we can do at that time to try and slow or limit the progress of disease and hopefully buy them lots and lots of good years of use out of that joint. On the right is that bone on bone stuff we talked about, where the bone is actually, the two bones are actually touching. The meniscus in that knee is either absent or it sort of gets pushed out to the side like a watermelon seed, and it no longer provides any cushioning. And that's very painful. The bone has a lot of nerve endings in it, and eventually folks will come to me saying, you know what, enough's enough, and let's do something different. Similarly, the arthritis in a hip joint uh, is wear of that joint surface cartilage. So it doesn't show it well in this picture, but the actual socket or cup side also has that lining of joint surface cartilage. So again, when you get wear on both the socket side or the pelvis side and the thigh bone or femur side, eventually you end up with bone on bone arthritis. So again, on x-rays, the left side, that normal hip, you see that round socket, the round ball fitting well in there with that open space between the two. Those are the two, that's the space that the actual articular cartilage takes up. So that's actual normal healthy cartilage that's giving that space between the two bones. The right hip is actually definitely very arthritic, but also a little unusual in that that hip has had what we call developmental dysplasia, meaning it never formed correctly when the person was a child or an infant, and eventually that hip wears very prematurely. And those are frequently folks who will sometimes need hip replacements as early as occasionally teens, but certainly it's not unusual to see them in their 30s and 40s coming in for hip replacement. Some other common causes of joint pain are what we call post-traumatic arthritis. So the reasons that people see injuries and degeneration of that articular surface can be that they have had an injury that damages the health of the cells in that cartilage layer. We only have as many of those as we're ever going to have when we're born. And if you have an injury that substantially impacts that joint layer, that joint articular cartilage, those cells will prematurely die, and the health of that cartilage is dramatically impacted. Some other common causes of or common questions that joint pain sufferers ask are, I usually feel pain in my groin and buttocks as well as my lower back? Is that really my hip? And I would tell you, this is one of those times when, as surgeons and physicians, we truly are investigators or detectives, because there is a lot of overlap between low back issues, hip issues, and sometimes even knee issues. And so we frequently have to put on our detective cap and say, okay, is this really hip pain? Is this really knee pain? I've had patients who have had horrible looking x-rays of their knees, but their story just didn't fit. And then we x-rayed their hip, and their hip was actually worse. And when we replaced their hip, their knee pain went away. So ultimately, it's up to us to figure all those things out. The other question people will say is, well, it doesn't always hurt. How can it be bone on bone? And that's really dependent on a lot of factors. Your level of activity, how much the health of the bone has it been impacted by your activities at that time. And It's certainly possible that it isn't always painful, but if it's painful enough to limit your activities, it's certainly worth an evaluation. And that night pain or rest pain, same question down below is, why does my knee wake me up at night? When you get to the point where there is that constant pressure across the bone without good cushioning, the bone itself starts to lose some of its ability to tolerate load, and you'll have that achy pain at nighttime. So non-surgical treatments, and I promised we would talk about this, and we definitely are. And in fact, I really, really, really encourage my patients to try all of these things before we even consider a joint replacement, even if they come in with x-rays that show they have bone-on-bone arthritis. Because just because you have x-rays that may show that doesn't necessarily mean that your knee will always be painful, or your hip, quite frankly. So when we talk about non-surgical options, my mantra is strength conditioning and weight management. I say it probably 50 times a day, and we talk about how important it is to condition. So I talk about conditioning as low impact or no impact activities, aerobic activities like walking, biking, swimming. Uh, Strengthening is separate and different from those sorts of conditioning exercises. You have to target those specific muscle groups that support the joint mechanics in order to unload the joint from gravity. And the conditioning allows you to use that strength over time. And then weight management. Gravity is gravity, and we all fight it. And the more weight you carry around, the more you fight it. If you lose a pound, you're actually taking 4 to 5 pounds, depending on what study you read, off of your knees. And that is actually up to about 7 times off your hip. So the idea of weight management, whether that's 5 pounds, 50 pounds, or 100 pounds, it's all very, very important and dictates a lot of how much symptomatology you'll have in your joint. There's plenty of folks in my practice who have lost weight and been able to put off their joint replacement sometimes for years and years. Other non-surgical treatment options, although these are never high on anyone's list, but they do work. And those are things like walking aids, and canes and walkers certainly allow you to unload actually a knee joint about 40% simply by using a cane. And so for folks who aren't in a position to have a surgery, or perhaps they're just not at a point in their life where they're ready to take that leap, this is certainly a reasonable, viable option. Um, Heat and cold definitely can be ways to manage symptoms. And there's no real magic to that. If you've got swelling from an acute injury, we would recommend ice. But otherwise, if it's simply trying to manage pain symptoms, try out each. Some people like heat, some people like cold, and neither one is the right or wrong answer. Other things that we can do are things like physical therapy, and I would submit to you that this is actually very, very important. The physical therapy doesn't end when you leave the therapist's office, though, and that's why I talk about strengthening. So the physical therapist teaches you the exercises that you should be doing, but honestly, this is I frequently use the phrase, this is the medicine you take for your knees. This is what you do to maintain your strength. And if you do this on a daily basis, consistently over time, there are many, many folks that can markedly improve their symptoms rather than see them get worse. There's a sort of a misconception that if you do too much activity or do too much work with your joints, that they'll actually be more painful. And in fact, it's more typical that the more you work on some of those specific strengthening activities and light aerobic activities, the better your joints feel. Other things we can use are things like nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory medicines, ibuprofen or Aleve. Also, hundreds of actual prescription NSAIDs are available. So those are some of the things that we can do. Cortisone injections are something we frequently do. Many, many patients find good relief with cortisone injections, but we also we use them judiciously because we can't consistently do injections multiple times over the course of a year. And when it gets to that point where we aren't able to utilize that as a sort of a stopgap measure for a longer period of time, we should certainly start to move on to more of a surgical discussion. There are other viscosupplementation injections as well. That is another type of lubricant injection, but those also have sort of a lifespan of effectiveness. So When is it time to start to talk about a surgical option? And the answer is that if you haven't been able to utilize those conservative treatments with good improvement, and you're less active because of your joint pain, or it keeps you from doing things you want to do, it keeps you from getting a good night's sleep, it's certainly worth the conversation. Obviously, everyone has a different story. Everyone has different sets of factors that impact that decision, and impact timing. But it's always a good idea to start the conversation early, to believe that you have some ability to manage some of that without surgery. But if it gets to that, having a frank discussion about, are you a good candidate and is now the time? So hip replacement is a replacement of both the socket side and the ball side of that hip joint. And there are at least 300,000 hip replacements done in the year in the US. These statistics that I'm showing you are actually from 2017. There have been minor updates in those numbers over the last few years, but not enough to dramatically impact the conversation. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of people that need hip replacements every single year. And again, that number is growing. So how it works is during surgery, the end of the femur bone is actually cut off right at the corner, basically, right where it takes a turn and heads into the hip socket. And then there is a stem that fits down inside the thigh bone, and attached to that is a either metal, plastic, or ceramic ball. On the hip socket side, the pelvis is actually contoured using what's called a reamer, and it's sort of like a cheese grater, and it forms the right size socket to fit the prosthesis, or the part that's going to stick into the pelvis. And then between the two, there's some sort of liner. And again, that liner can be made of many different types of materials, either, again, ceramic, metal, plastic. And there's all sorts of combinations of these that are used based on patient demand, patient anatomy factors, etc. So this is just a little video showing you, very stylized, of course, but kind of what happens when they replace a hip. It's not that easy to strip off all the soft tissues, I'll tell you that. But the pelvis side is fit. There's a size that's determined, and inside that is typically a plastic liner, and then the stem down into the femur. The length of that neck can be determined intraoperatively as well, so that ultimately there's really nothing that holds the two together other than your own muscles and ligaments. Switching over to knee replacements, there is an option for a partial versus a total knee replacement. Some people feel like this may be an actual progression over time, and that's actually not necessarily the case. Based on some people's mechanics and how their joints load, they are much more likely to have a single-sided joint disease than other folks who have had either a trauma, or their disease is based on other factors, particularly things like rheumatoid arthritis. So this slide, although it looks like it proceeds from one to the other, that's not an unusual progression, but it's not necessarily everyone has that same issue. So when we talk about a partial versus a total knee replacement, what are we talking about? So if you look on the left there, what's happened is that person only had wear on the inside part of their knee. So there's a special component that's sized and fit to the inside part of the joint, and as on both the femur and the tibia side, and then a little plastic bearing that is placed between the two that actually opens that space up again and rebalances the joint. In a full knee replacement, you replace all of those compartments, and the three compartments are the inside and the outside and the kneecap. And so you can replace, some surgeons are not replacing kneecaps currently. I continue to do that as I feel like that's a significant source of symptoms for a lot of patients, but there certainly is literature to support either one of those options. In a partial knee replacement, again, we only replace the one side. This may take a second to load here, so bear with me. There we go. So the diseased part of the knee is simply on the inside part, on that what we call the medial side of the knee. And so that diseased cartilage, you can see, is now worn off and bone is exposed. So we've utilized the robot and a three-dimensional model of the joint that's developed from a CT scan that the patient has pre-surgically, and we contour that side of the bone to receive a component both on the femur side and the tibia or thigh bone side. And again, you can see that little white plastic bearing between the two. And that's actually, we have multiple thicknesses of that so that we can rebalance that joint. Partial knee replacements can be what we call unicondylar, and this is by far the most common. Partial knee replacements aren't nearly as common as full knee replacements, just because there's sort of a, you have to have the absolute proper indication for them. So the unicondylar, which is either inside of the knee, and that's probably 95+% of unicondylar knee replacements are on the inside part. It can be the outside or lateral side of the knee. You can also do an isolated kneecap replacement. These are actually probably more common even than the lateral or outside replacements. And then you can do bicompartmental, although I would tell you that these are few and far between. These are rare birds, and actually two things. Number one is most surgeons feel like you can balance a joint better with a full knee replacement if you actually need to do two compartments. And insurances will rarely cover that procedure. They feel it's investigational. So this number is actually now about 760,000 total knees completed in the US. This was 2017. So ultimately, I would tell you that this is the number continues to creep up, and we are well aware that we are going to need to be very efficient and nimble and able to take care of all of these patients. So again, this will load here shortly, and we'll show you a little stylized video of a knee replacement. There is no video with or audio with this, so don't think you're missing something. Again, you see the diseased compartments and bony surfaces, so we contour those to fit the prosthesis. We have a size that we then make the bone the correct fit for that size based on the patient's anatomy, fit the plate onto the tibia, and again, the sizes of or thicknesses of that polyethylene or plastic between the two in order to balance that joint. So what are some common questions we get? This is actually an interesting one. Can I have an allergic reaction to the implant? And the answer is well, you never say never. Um, I have had many patients who have had severe uh, metal or nickel allergies and have yet to have one that required a change. There is only one company on the market that has a knee that is not metal based. The outcomes of those are a little equivocal. And at the end of the day, that I have yet, like I said, to have anybody that had an allergic reaction to the implant. Even with severe nickel allergies, people who cannot wear certain types of jewelry, etc. There still is, there's so little of those types of metals in these alloys that people tolerate them very well. Will it set off a metal detector? The answer is yes. And people will frequently say, well, my sister got a card when she had her knee done 10 years ago that says that she has a knee replacement. And what I tell folks is we can get those, but the airlines no longer care. TSA doesn't care if you have a card on you or not. They want to know that you don't have a gun strapped next to your knee replacement. So I tell folks, wear shorts or wear a skirt, something that you can show them that you don't have anything next to your joint replacement. The new X-ray scanners obviously can show that exactly what it is. And so most of those are actually very appropriate for folks who have had joint replacements. And is the implant heavy? And the answer is the implant isn't heavy. It is less than a pound. It certainly is something that folks they'll sometimes say to me, it really does feel heavy. And I think most of the time that's related to the fact that early on and they still have some strength deficits. And usually by the time they come back to see me at their 1-year follow-up, they say, no, it really doesn't feel heavy to me anymore. So how is technology transforming this for us? And this is actually the exciting part and the fun part of this discussion. This is the Mako Robotic-Arm Assisted technology that we use. So it's not the robot that's doing the surgery. The surgeon runs the robot. There are multiple attachments for the arm of the robot that we use for different portions of the surgery, but ultimately it's a matter of developing that three-dimensional model of the patient's specific anatomy, their specific bony anatomy from a CT scan that's then input as digital data into the robot. And that information is then utilized during surgery. We capture some additional data to confirm our model. We capture some information about the range of motion and what we call kinematics of the joint, so joint balancing. And then we add all of that up together to, and then prior to starting any surgery, we position the implant with within the constraints of the robot, and that's able to help us put that in exactly like we want it. So the Mako system is used for all of those surgeries that we previously talked about. It allows that personalized plan that I discussed, and it allows us to protect the ligaments and soft tissues around the joint. Sydney, this is that video that takes a bit to load. And so I don't know if you have any housekeeping things you want to do right at this moment.
Yeah, great question. So at this time, we are open to taking questions. Again, this is found in the chat at the very bottom of your screen, right in the very middle. So please, at this time, if you do have a question, we can answer a couple of them. However, if there are no questions, we'll talk a little bit about what you can expect after this presentation from Dr. Schaap. So you will receive an email tomorrow that will have a link to a consultation form. This consultation form will go right to the St. Cloud Surgical Center, and somebody will be able to follow up to that and just set a meeting to talk a little bit further about your questions. So again, something to look forward to at that time. Yep, I see a question here in the chat. It looks like, yes, you to type in the question, that will be how we do give those to Dr. Schaap. So please type them in the chat. Good question. I see Text iPhone typing. Text iPhone, did you have a question for us?
I apologize this video takes so long, but I think it's worth our time to wait for it.
I would agree. Okay, here is a question for you, Dr. Schaap.
Okay.
So the question is, do you have any information about the stress of being bow-legged?
Yes, so that's exactly what I was talking about when I said that there are certain folks who, because they're almost always bow-legged, sometimes knock-kneed, but almost always bow-legged, that will only wear out that inside part of their knee, and that definitely is those mechanics that what we call mechanical access. So where your joint force falls from your hip to your ankle is inside on the inside part of your knee. And that part of the joint will definitely wear faster if you are just genetically programmed to be bow-legged. And that it frequently runs in families. And actually the knock-kneed posture can also run in families. Men are more likely to be bow-legged than women, and women are more likely to be knock-kneed, but that isn't always the case. And certainly it does generate more force on that one side of the joint.
So a follow-up question to that, is it generally a partial or a full?
In that instance, if there really is that isolated wear on that inside part of the knee, then a partial replacement is perfect for those patients. Sometimes folks will have a little bit of wear in their kneecap joint, but again, all on that inside part. So if we do a partial replacement, we actually line them up again. We realign their joint and unload that inside part of the kneecap. So they actually still do very, very well with a partial replacement.
Thank you again for the answer. Again, remember, as we're waiting for this to load, there will be a question and answer portion at the end, and we'll take some of Dr. Schaap's time to go through that. If you're not comfortable asking questions here on the chat, please understand that that is absolutely fine, but be on the lookout tomorrow for that email coming through from St. Cloud Surgical Center that does have that consultation form, and you'll be able to answer your questions or ask your questions more in a private setting, excuse me, at that time as well. So
I'm not sure how I still believe this will load. I just don't know how long it's going to take.
that's the beauty of Zoom meetings, isn't it?
Yeah.
We just see how long technology wants
Oh
to
yeah.
wait. Yes. It is a great video, I have to agree.
Yeah, I don't know why it's taking so long. Maybe it's my country internet out here, you never know.
We'll give it a bit longer, see what it's
Um,
like here.
Maybe I can speak a little bit, Sydney, to some of the things we've been doing both at St. Cloud Orthopedics and St. Cloud Surgical Center regarding the COVID-19 issues and some of the precautions we've been taking. At our clinic, we actually just recently, just this week, were able to open up to more actual in-clinic appointments. So we're able to take those appointments. We are stretching patients out during the day so that we aren't seeing as many patients in a day, simply to avoid having full lobbies, full x-ray waiting rooms, etc. But we definitely are seeing patients. So if you are at a point where you need to get seen, please call and we will be happy to start to make those appointments. We have been doing temperature checks on folks as they come in the door. We have social distancing set up in our lobby in terms of which chairs are available, etc. All of our employees are wearing masks for patient contact. And similarly, St. Cloud Surgical Center will now be able to open up next week to elective surgeries. And we will be planning on testing every single patient who was supposed to have a surgery there within 72 hours prior to their surgery to be sure that they don't have the COVID-19 illness. As also, again, all employees, et cetera, are wearing masks, temperature checks. So we're really being cautious. We're trying to do our very best not to spread any disease. And on the other hand, feel like patients have waited a long time and they certainly have disability related to things other than this illness. And so we're happy that we've been allowed to open up a little bit and start to move on. Still
Absolutely.
not seeing anything there, Sydney. I don't know if we want to wait still or.
Why don't we see if we can come back to it during the question and answer portion, and then that way
Okay.
we can still do questions, and yeah, how about that?
Yeah, I think that's great. Okay.
Perfect.
So this is a question, and when I do this presentation live, I ask folks in the audience if they can tell me what these are. But of course, that's not how we're rolling tonight. So I'll answer it for you. And in fact, these are CT scans. On the left is a knee CT, or what people frequently call a CAT scan. And on the right is a hip. And these are what we call axial images, meaning that they kind of slice you like a loaf of bread from top to bottom. So when you look at this hip and pelvis, you can see the whole contour of the pelvis there. And then as you move down further, you see the actual hip and the ball in the socket. On the left in the knee joint, you can see the kneecap sitting on top, and then the contour of that femur. And that's how we utilize the robot and this digital information to actually start with sizes that we believe are appropriate. We can adjust those in the operating room, or even pre-surgically a little bit if I feel like when I come into the operating room, I look at the plan and say, I know I want to flex that thing a little bit more and I want to slide it back. And so that's going to make this a size 5 instead of a size 4. So before surgery, that CT scan gets done, it gets turned into that 3D virtual model in the computer, and then it's loaded into the Mako system software, and that's where we create your personalized plan. So that CT scan then becomes on it looks like on the right. So the top is that total knee replacement, full knee replacement, both a metal component on the femur or the thigh bone and a metal component on the tibia below. On the bottom is the partial replacement. And again, we are able to fit that in 3 dimensions. We can flex it, we can spin it, we can pin it on one side and spin the back part. So it certainly gives us many degrees of freedom to implant this correctly and get the best alignment. In a hip, similarly, we use that CT scan to create this 3-dimensional model of that hip joint. And there are lots of things that go into this, not the least of which ultimately ends up as a defining factor of limb length. So one of the issues with hip replacements in the past has been patient feels like their leg is long or their leg is short. And in fact, they are long or short. In this modeling, we can understand offset, meaning how far away is that femur from the pelvis? What's that angle that it enters the pelvis on that normal side? And then what are the lengths going to look like when we're all done with that? In the operating room, then again, the robotic arm assists us with making the bone preparation that allows us then to precisely place those implants so that we come out with exactly that soft tissue tensioning, balancing, range of motion that we had planned for. On the far left, the hip, I told you that how we prepare that socket is a reamer that actually makes that that half circle in the bone exactly the right shape and depth. And that portion of it is actually controlled by the robot. So the angle that enters the pelvis and the depth that enters the pelvis is actually controlled by the robot. In the middle is that partial knee. And we use a burr for portions of this to contour the bone, although this has actually changed since this slide where we do use a saw for some portions of it, but we still do use a burr. And then on the far right is the total knee where we use a saw. And you can see that saw on the outline in the very front or the bottom of that slide. And ultimately what happens is as you use this, that green goes away. That's the part of the bone we want to take off in order to have it prepared correctly. And so when you go from green to white, that means you've taken off enough bone. So it's a little like doing a video game. Can't think of it right now. I'm looking at my son's video game sitting on the floor here, but it's like doing a video game where you got to watch the screen rather than watch the what you're doing inside the joint, which is where your assistants come in. They're always watching inside the joint, making sure we're not doing things we don't want to be doing. But the computer stops you before you get to those green outlines that you see. After surgery, this is what the x-rays look like. Again, that on that left side, that hip replacement with the stem down the center of the hip or on the center of the femur and the socket contoured to accept that ball. On the middle, that partial knee replacement, and you can see how just if you were bow-legged, imagine if you were that bow-legged person and now you've got that space opened up on the inside and that alignment is corrected. And the total knee replacement on the far side. Again, able to correct over a longer space and a larger distance. That's actually easier to correct deformity, especially significant deformity with a full knee replacement than it is with a partial. Partial's technically more difficult than a full. We're going to talk about the triathlon total knee implants. This is the Stryker knee replacement that is married to the technology of the Mako robot. And Stryker bought this technology from a smaller company, and they did marry it to their very, very successful triathlon single radius knee. This is the least revised prosthesis in the world. It allows more normal knee flexion, so better range of motion with less effort, less requirement for quad strength. And so this has been a very successful joint replacement that came on the market sometime ago, I believe 2004, and yet still the least revised and one of the most implanted joint replacements on the market. So the concept of not having to use as much strength in order to make your joint move allows people to do things much more normally. It allows you to walk with less effort, so over longer periods of time and on longer distances, but it also plays a role in your ability to get up out of a chair and ultimately simply that early recovery. If this joint functions well, you're going to move easier and move more quickly. So here's some questions about that Mako now that it's been married to that successful triathlon knee replacement is how long has it been around? It's actually been around for a very long time. This was a very small company. It was a startup company. They developed the robot. But they also just simply made their own components to work with the robot. They did not have the marketing power or the market share to be able to drive this. And so it was really pretty isolated in a part down in Florida, where the guys that developed it did most of the surgeries, but they did the first one in 2006. And there were 83,000 of them done around the world before Stryker purchased this technology. Does the robotic arm actually perform surgery? Well, hopefully you guys can answer that already, because it doesn't. It's us, it's the surgeons guiding the robot. It's us making the decisions about the implant position even before we start making any of the bone preparation. But ultimately, it's still up to us to turn the bone cutting instruments on and off. And it just prevents us from getting in too deep, going in too far, getting into structures that we want to stay out of, but also most importantly, just three-dimensionally having that cut or that bone preparation be perfectly aligned so that we can balance that joint and get a good result. After surgery, you'll work with the physical therapist. They're your next best friend, although you won't like them very well for a while. Knee replacements, particularly hip replacements, don't require a lot of formal physical therapy. They tend to get better simply by getting up and moving, getting up out of a chair, some of those functional activities. But knees really require a lot of intensive physical therapy to get a good result, because they do swell, they get stiff. And if you don't work through that, you won't like your result, even if your joint replacement is perfect and perfectly balanced. Obviously, everyone has a little bit different result. It is certainly important not to remember, or to remember that it does not allow you to go back to doing everything you did when you were 20 years old. Our goal is to allow you to get back to a very functional level of activity. We don't recommend that you run or do pounding activities. But if you were an accomplished skier beforehand, can you go back to doing that? Most of the time. And definitely walking, golfing, those activities we recommend that you do some additional form of non-impact cardio to maintain your health and strength. Usually folks will be able to drive about 4 to 6 weeks after surgery. Now, obviously this is a little dependent on whether or not you have a left or a right. And if you're one of those folks that drives with both feet, don't tell me, please don't tell me. But if you had a right total knee replacement, you've got good strength and range of motion at 6 weeks, and you're not taking narcotic pain medicines, then is it appropriate to go back to driving? Probably. So that is actually the end of this portion of the presentation, and I'm going to show just a quick couple of disclaimers here from Stryker and the references for this. If anybody wants these, certainly send that through chat and I can forward these to you. And then I'm going to go back and see if that video will load, and we can do a few questions if folks are ready.
Good idea. All right, so while we wait for that to load, we'll go ahead and see if you have any, as we are in the question and answer portion of the presentation, feel free to ask any questions here in the chat. I am going to type in the chat at this time. If you are unsure of where the button is, you should, if you scroll over your screen, see it blinking. Let me just, so if you see, please type here in the chat box. You can go ahead and type your message into that, and that will go live. Once you do that, I can give that question to Dr. Schaap. Hopefully the video will load this time.
Yeah, hopefully, because it is a good video. But
yes,
it's a patient story about a young woman who underwent a hip replacement, and I think there's some good information there.
Some value, yeah. So again, after this is finished up tomorrow, you will receive an email that does include that consultation form where you may ask questions, set up a meeting with the St. Cloud Surgical Center in relation to St. Cloud Orthopedics as well. So please be on the lookout for that. At the end of this presentation, we will actually have a slide up with contact information, Dr. Schaap's information, and so you'll be able to take a look at that. And we'll leave that live for a few minutes after this presentation is over. So you'll be able to copy that as well.
You can type a joke in the chat if you want.
We had a member say, no questions, just hope to see the OR soon. Thank you.
Well, must be time, because most people don't say that. So.
I think so. Dr. Schaap, you may have received some questions in your chat box privately, so I don't know if you have a minute to check that, but I know you might have to quit screen sharing to
see
those.
Where do I see those, Sydney?
So if you scroll to the top, it should either the top or bottom where it says stop sharing, or all of those others. Is there an option to see the chat?
Let's see.
It's like a red button, I think.
Hi, Al. Okay, I think that, yeah, I don't see anything there that's new. I think we've talked about those.
Okay.
Oh, it's up. Hang on, let me get out of here.
Oh, there we go.
All right,
Perfect.
we're still going to get to do this. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
I am the mother of 3. I am the grandmother of 1. I have a husband who's a firefighter who's very active. For 20 years, I was an operating room nurse where I was on my feet all day. I was also very physically active. Biking, running, hiking, I was involved in everything. The first time I experienced hip pain was after a race. I didn't think anything of it. I thought that it would go away, so I kept pushing myself at work and with my weekly exercise routine. But I found myself slowing down. My range of motion kept decreasing, and I couldn't do the things that I used to do. When I finally decided to speak to an orthopedic specialist, it was too late. The arthritis had worn down the cartilage in my hip, creating bone-on-bone contact. It got to the point where the only recommended treatment option by my surgeon was to have a total hip replacement. Hip pain is exhausting. It is debilitating. I couldn't sleep more than an hour at night. I had trouble walking any distance at all. I stopped exercising completely. It's debilitating and depressing. It affected every aspect of my life. The pain eventually became so bad, I was looking forward to surgery. Looking back, I can't believe I waited so long. I had surgery on December 22nd, and the staff had me up and moving later on that afternoon. I was on my way to the airport after having surgery to go home, and I got a call from my family that my daughter was going into labor. Now that's perfect timing. The Mako total hip replacement was a great choice for me. I feel better than I have in a long time. I can get back to the activities that I love to do. I should never have put it off for so long. I do a lot of walking. Walking's great exercise for me. I also use the stationary bicycle, where I'm trying to build my muscles up so I can go back out on my road bike again. I would tell anyone not to wait as long as I did. I was in severe pain by the time I went into the hospital. I'm so happy with my result, and I plan to accomplish even more next year.
All right.
Is that the end of the video?
That is the end of the video. So we'll, I'll put up that information slide.
Perfect. There we go. So that is St. Cloud Orthopedics information for visits, OrthoDirect visits, anything there. Again, see that consultation form there at the very bottom, but it will be emailed to all attendees of the Zoom meeting. We will just take a couple more minutes to see if we do receive any questions. If we do not, we will be done with this presentation. I believe that this video will be available to view later on at a different location, and that will be communicated to you at that time if you would be interested in looking into it. Dr. Schaap, is there anything you wanted to share at the very end here?
Only thank you, Sydney, for helping me through this. This is a unique experience for us, but I anticipate that this is a format that we'll probably see going forward as well. And certainly understand that if you do have questions about joint pain, it does not mean that you're going to need a surgery, but we're certainly there to help you with all sorts of other non-surgical options as well. But no, I appreciate everybody attending, and hopefully it was helpful for you to see this and listen to this. And if there are folks, Al, we'll see you soon, folks that are ready to move forward, then we are happy to take care of you. I think this is a great technology. I really do think this is something that is special and unique and growing. It's one of the topics of our national meeting more and more and more is robotic assisted surgeries. And so I think we're very fortunate to have this level of technology embedded into our local orthopedic community.
Absolutely. We did get one question about the video. If you did miss the video, this was a success story. Dr. Schaap, just this last video that played, it was a success story of a hip replacement. Yep. And thank you, Al. He said, thank you both for your time. Well done. We're excited that the Zoom worked.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, just to respect everybody's time, we'll say thank you so much. We'll keep this information up and we'll let Dr. Schaap. Oh, I take that back. We do have a question. It is, do you have an opinion on PRP?
Yes, actually, we do PRP in our office. We do stem cells in our office. I think those are valid treatments for patients who, but it has to be the right setting and the right model. It doesn't make sense to do those in the face of severe arthritic change. The odds of that being a long-term solution are pretty rare. And if the patient's already a good candidate for surgery, if there's someone who's healthy and in their 70s, again, it's a large out-of-pocket expense when you can have a long-term solution with a joint replacement. But for somebody who's maybe in their 50s, who has more moderate disease and they're still trying to work full-time, and those certainly could be viable options. And we do have all of those options within our office.
Thank you. Lisa did say thank you, Dr. Schaap, for taking the time to share this info with us privately. We do have another question. Do all insurances, cover using the robot?
So the answer is we don't charge for the robot because pretty much no insurances cover it. So the only additional charge is the CT scan, and they will pay for that. The only type of insurance, there's two types of insurances out of the VA. They're Tri-West insurance, but there's two different types. One will pay for the CT scan, one will not. So those are the only folks. And so in that instance, we do what we've been doing for years, which is called computer-assisted navigation. So we use some form of assistance in the operating room to help position the components. But ultimately, because we felt that this was a technology that was important for our patients and our community, we've actually absorbed the cost of the robots and their maintenance to be able to offer that to folks.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions? Feel free to drop those in the chat. Give it a couple more minutes. I am not seeing anything come through at this time. So Dr. Schaap, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, I will actually throw up this slide as well on my screen, so you all will be able to see it. and we'll let you get back to your evening. Thank you so much to everybody for coming. We absolutely appreciate it. It's always good to see people, even though we need to be socially distanced, but just to do it responsibly and still gain information is incredibly important. So, and thank you, Dr. Scott, for just being willing to jump on this and do this. We really appreciate it. So,
Yeah, thanks for everyone for coming, and thanks, Sydney. Good
yeah,
job.
thank you. You too. All right. Well, have a great night, everyone. Again, I'll leave up my screen for a couple more minutes, and then we will call it a night.